For to be free is not merely to cast off one's chains, but to live in a way that respects and enhances the freedoms of others. That is a quote from Nelson Mandela from his book, Long Walk to Freedom. Good day and welcome to the show. This is Robin Jackson, and you're listening to Cult Life. We have an interesting show lined up. We will focus on three topics today. Number one is Nelson Mandela's fleeting brush with the Jehovah's Witnesses and its effects on his marriage. We will also focus on the Watchtower and racism. And then the third topic is conscription and the compulsory military service for white males during the Apartheid South African era, and how it affected, many of the white brothers over the age of 18. So I hope you enjoy, and thanks for joining me. Most people know Nelson Mandela as SA's first democratically elected president after his incarceration for about 27 years on Robben Island. Most won't know that his first wife became a Jehovah's Witness while they were still married. They married in 1944 after Nelson Mandela was introduced to Evelyn by Walter Sisulu, who was a fellow member of the African National Congress at the time. They had 4 children, and Evelyn got introduced to the Jehovah's Witnesses around about the year 1954. And I want to actually read an extract from Long Walk to Freedom, where Nelson Mandela actually explains, and in his own words, how he became to, over the course of his marriage, and how he actually, how it affected him. So here's a bit of an extract from Long Walk to Freedom. He says there, over the course of the next year, Evelyn became involved in the Watchtower organization, part of the Church of Jehovah's Witnesses. Whether this was due to some dissatisfaction with her life at the time, I do not know. The Jehovah's Witnesses took the Bible as the sole rule of faith and believed in a coming Armageddon between good and evil. Evelyn zealously began distributing their publication, The Watchtower, and began to proselytize me as well, urging me to convert my commitment to the struggle to a commitment to God. Although I found some aspects of the Watchtower system to be interesting and worthwhile, I could not and did not share her devotion. There was an obsessional element to it that put me off. From what I could discern, her faith toward passivity and submissiveness in the face of oppression, something I could not accept. So Nelson was, by this time, I think, highly invested in his political activism and the struggle against the apartheid government. And I suppose Evelyn, his wife, would naturally try and convince him to join the Witnesses. We all know, as former Jehovah's Witnesses, how partners and marriage mates are tried or encouraged to preach to their mates and to bring them into the fold. And this is probably what happened. I guess Evelyn, zealously tried to do that. He goes on to say, another quote from the book, he says, I tried to persuade her of the necessity of the struggle, while she attempted to persuade me of the value of religious faith. When I would tell her that I was serving the nation, she would reply that serving God was above serving the nation. We were finding no common ground. Now you can just imagine the struggle and the pressure within that household. between the political will of Nelson and the spiritual devotion of Evelyn to the Watchtower. And he goes on to say, we also waged a battle for the minds and hearts of the children. She wanted them to be religious. I thought they should be political. She would take them to church or the Kingdom Hall at every opportunity and read them the Watchtower literature. She even gave the boys Watchtower pamphlets to distribute in the townships. I used to talk politics to the boys, and he goes on to explain how one of the boys became a juvenile member of the ANC, and how he tried to instill into them how the black man was being persecuted by the white man. Well, eventually, I think the differences of opinion and ideologies were too great a force, and he goes on to say that Evelyn and I had irreconcilable differences. I could not give up my life in the struggle, and she could not live with my devotion to something other than herself and the family. She was nevertheless a very good woman, charming, strong, and faithful, and a fine mother. So I think this was probably a catalyst for the eventual breakdown of the marriage, amongst other things. I won't say it was the only reason why the marriage eventually broke down. And if you read Long Walk to Freedom, there were other differences and there were other issues at play, and that eventually led to the breakdown of the marriage and the eventual divorce. He's divorcing from Evelyn. Evelyn, just as a side fact, she eventually died in 2004 at the age of 81. So she lived a long life, and of course we all know what happened. Nelson Mandela went on to become a force to be reckoned with in politics and the anti-apartheid movement at the time, and became South Africa's first democratically elected president. This brings me to the second point with regards to this whole issue. We know Nelson Mandela was a very strong opponent of the apartheid government. And although the Watchtower today prides itself on racial harmony within its ranks, its history tells a totally different story. As if we look back into the writings of the Watchtower, as far back as the founder, Charles Taze Russell, there were racial attitudes in the writings of the Watchtower that were very degrading, and I think some of these writings are things that the organization would much rather hide from its followers than actually make it known and want them to see this. And I don't think many non-white or black South Africans especially have ever researched the history and come across these writings. Zion's Watchtower of October 1900 is a very interesting case study in the attitudes that Charles Taze Russell had with regards to the black man. October the 1st, in pages 296 to 297, he tells a story of this Reverend William H. Draper, which was a pastor of the Logan Memorial Church, that was once black as charcoal, and the Reverend Draper is now white. And he says his people say that his color was changed in answer to prayer. Many years ago, Draper was employed by a fair-skinned man, and he was often heard to remark that if he could only be white like his employer, he would be happy. While in the white man's service, Draper experienced religion. Shocking how at the time and how, and these are writings in the Watchtower, how it was it was the white man's skin, or the white man was seen to be more desirable. It was more seen as to be more desirable to be a white man than to be a black man at that stage. And this comes out of the Watchtower. A few other quotes that I'd just like to mention. Can the Ethiopian change his skin? This comes from the Watchtower of February 15, 1904. How could all men be brought to perfection, and which color of skin was the original? The answer is now provided. God can change the Ethiopian skin in his own due time. Professor H.A. Edwards, he goes on to say there, has written for the public press an elaborate description of how Julius Jackson of New Frankfurt, a Negro boy of 9 years, began to grow white in September 1901 and is now fully 9/10 white. Just an example again of how, the Watchtower was so besotted with the white skin, and how blacks could become white. 19. I'll quote one more. It says here, the Golden Age, 1929. The question is there anything in the Bible that reveals the origin of the Negro? The answer: it is generally believed that the curse which Noah pronounced upon Canaan was the origin of the black race. Goes on to say they have been a race of servants. There is no servant in the world as good as a good colored servant. So, and there's many more writings that I could quote out of the Watchtower writings. And as I said, these are probably publications and writings that the Watchtower would much rather hide from their followers, the rank and file Jehovah's Witnesses. So the Watchtower does have a very murky past and in its early history of very degrading racial attitudes, especially to blacks. And on the topic of apartheid, South Africa, this brings me to an issue that was not very well known to many people, to many Jehovah's Witnesses and to many former Jehovah's Witnesses. And this is the issue surrounding conscription under the apartheid government. Conscription and compulsory military service for white males over the age of 18 in South Africa. South Africa had a policy of compulsory military conscription for all males at the time under the apartheid government. This meant that they had to spend 12 months, and then eventually it was increased to a period of 2 years or 24 months serving in the military. And of course, we all know the stand that the witnesses take when it comes to regarding affairs, political affairs, affairs of the government and military. They are encouraged to be no part of the world. So, of course, witness males were encouraged to object to this, and the result was that many witness males, of course, were conscripted and called up, and objections were raised, and the result was that many were imprisoned for up to 4 years for refusing to do military service for a period of 2 years. But the issue I want to raise here is that what a lot of people do not know is that the South African Defence Act at the time made provision for religious conscientious objectors. And there were two ways in which a certain limited category of objectors could be afforded relief by the administrative section of the government or the military at the time. And in both cases, the relief provided went no further than posting of some of these objectors to positions where they could render military service in a non-combatant capacity. So the Defence Act, and it's in Section 67, actually provided for these conscientious objectors. The section merely creates the possibility for conscientious objectors to be assigned to non-combatant service, subject to administrative discretion. So this is not a right which one could insist on in a court of law. The officials would exercise that right and their discretion when the objector was from a recognized religious denomination. And in practice, this meant that members of the Jehovah's Witnesses, the Society of Friends, the Seventh-day Adventists, and other smaller groups were able to gain this concession under this act. And it says in Section 97 that conscientious objectors may also be granted exemption from combatant service in the South African Defence Force. A person who bona fide belongs and adheres to a recognized religious denomination by the tenets whereof its members may not participate in war may be granted exemption from serving in any combatant capacity, but shall, if called upon to do so, serve in a non-combatant capacity. So the law provided for this. However, we know that Jehovah's Witnesses, because of their staunch and unwavering stance, refuse to recognize any state authorities indiscriminately. So they were thrown into detention, what was called detention barracks. So basically witnesses were imprisoned for the completion of their terms of imprisonment. And what used to happen was, after the completion of their imprisonment, after the time served, they were again called up to render military service and again given the opportunity to serve in a non-combatant capacity. And when I speak about non-combatant capacity, I speak of they were given the opportunity to work in the laundry, to work as cooks, to work as cleaners, and so forth. So they weren't given the opportunity to do full-on military service, but they were given the opportunity to serve in those lesser, so to speak, capacities in the military. And even within the detention barracks, or while in imprisonment, witnesses refused to wear the regulation military dress, that was allowed, that was afforded to them or given to them. And they suffered. Their civilian clothes were removed, and they were not issued with clothing other than the military uniform. And there's a story of one witness who served 3 terms in detention barracks. And he mentioned that he spent the winter months in nothing but his underclothes. In addition, the witnesses were punished for their refusal. Many were sentenced to repeated periods in solitary confinement. And this is sad because the government was prepared to accommodate the witnesses, the witness males, by giving them these non-combatant roles within the military, by being cooks, by teaching them to cook food, by teaching them, giving the opportunity to do work in the laundry services, in the cleaning services. However, of course, we all know that Jehovah's Witnesses vigorously opposed and refused to accept these lesser, so to speak, tasks within the military. And I know of many who were repeatedly sentenced, and some even spent as much as 6 years in detention barracks. and suffering solitary confinement at times. And even because they refused to wear the military garment, had to sleep in the underclothes, and they suffered. They really suffered. It was sad, and it's just an indictment on how the leaders were even not prepared to assist and help these brothers when it came to appearing before courts of law and so forth. There's stories of brothers at the time repeatedly being asked to appear before the military courts and explain their cases. And I remember one brother wrote that he repeatedly asked some of the elders in his congregation to accompany him, to help him state his case. And the elders point blank refused and made excuses because they didn't want to actually face the authorities when it came to this issue. So it's a sad indictment on how even the white male Jehovah's Witness brothers were treated under the apartheid government, and how the leaders, the Jehovah's Witness leaders, really weren't that forthcoming in assisting and making the concession for these brothers to be able to do the lesser known and meaning lesser tasks within the military, and thereby avoiding these lengthy jail terms that was afforded to these brothers. But we all know that the Jehovah's Witnesses like to use these issues and these stories as proof of their worldly persecution and how the world treats them. And this was foretold by Jesus in the Bible, that they will be persecuted for standing against the governments and Satan's organization. So it's just sad how this turned out. And we all know 1994, after the first democratic elections in South Africa, compulsory military service was scrapped, and no males were called up for compulsory military service ever again. So that's my little story or little podcast for today. I hope you enjoyed just a little brief history of Nelson Mandela and his little brush with the Jehovah's Witnesses, and his association with the Watchtower organization at the time. He wrote extensively about it in his book, The Long Walk to Freedom. Also, I just wanted to highlight the early writings and the how the blacks and how were treated, and how the early founding fathers of the organization viewed the non-whites in their writings. And it's all there in black and white. I mean, if anybody wants to research it, it's on the internet. It's there for all to see. And this is not something that many of the or former Jehovah's Witnesses are pulling out of their thumb or sucking out of their thumb. And in closing, I just want to leave you with a quote for today. And this quote by Nelson Mandela just reminds me of the whole shunning and disfellowshipping practice that the Jehovah's Witnesses and many cults also practice, where family members and mothers and fathers and grandfathers and grandchildren and children can so easily just cut off contact and with their family members, just because 8 men who are the leaders of this organization tell them to do so. 8 men who the rank and file will probably never meet in their lifetime. However, they choose to believe these 8 men sitting in their ivory tower in Warwick, New York, and direct this vast army of Jehovah's Witnesses, the rank and file, and tell them to cut off all contact and communication with their family members who are not Jehovah's Witnesses or those who have been disfellowshipped or excommunicated. And I want to leave you with this quote from Nelson Mandela. He says, "No one is born hating another person because of the color of his skin, or his background, or his religion. People must learn to hate, and if they can learn to hate, they can be taught to love. For love comes more naturally to the human heart than its opposite." That is a quote from Nelson Mandela in Long Walk to Freedom. I'll leave you with that. Thank you for joining me this evening. Until next time.